The AIDS epidemic has now existed for over 15 years, during which time over 400,000 Americans have fallen victim to the syndrome. According to the U.S. federal government, the cause of this terrible plague was identified nearly 12 years ago, a virus named HIV. The government has spent some $40 billion fighting this virus, including funding tens of thousands of scientists to produce 100,000 papers on this single virus, more research than any other virus in human history. Yet, to this day, the government cannot demonstrate that it has saved a single life from AIDS. The largest biomedical program of all time has not produced a vaccine, an effective treatment, or even a proven method of prevention. Indeed, the epidemic continues to grow even as scientists find themselves totally unable to predict its course. In short, the government's massive war on AIDS has been a dismal failure. The following lecture will open your eyes to a shocking biomedical controversy inside the scientific establishment, possibly the largest and most important of the 20th century. Specifically, you will learn why many top researchers now believe that the government has blamed the AIDS epidemic on the wrong cause. This would explain why we are losing the war on AIDS. The HIV virus was officially named the cause of AIDS by the federal government in 1984 at a press conference, not a scientific forum. That announcement immediately ended funding for AIDS research in any other direction, forcing scientists to study only this virus as the assumed cause of the epidemic. But was the government right in identifying HIV as the culprit? Not according to hundreds of top scientists and physicians who now believe that something else may be the real cause of AIDS. Nor are these dissident researchers easy to dismiss. Among their growing ranks are prestigious scientists at Harvard, Yale, MIT, the University of California, the Pasteur Institute, and dozens of other major institutions. 3 of these dissenters have been recipients of the Nobel Prize in Medicine or Chemistry. Several are members of the National Academy of Sciences, and most are experts in fields directly relating to AIDS research. These scientists have managed to publish papers on this debate in many of the most respected scientific journals. They have also attracted some attention in the news media, including coverage in the Sunday Times of London and on ABC Television's Nightline. However, most of the public has never heard of this controversy. Each year, billions of taxpayer dollars pay for the careers of thousands of scientists or are funneled to AIDS activists, to medical organizations, and even to news media associations. A huge AIDS industry has been built on public fear of the so-called AIDS virus, and this lobby does not want the gravy train to stop. The AIDS establishment has retaliated against the dissenting scientists by cutting off their research funding, by preventing them from publishing papers in scientific journals, or by otherwise destroying their careers. In order to prevent this debate from becoming public knowledge, the government and AIDS establishment have intercepted and blocked most major television and newspaper interviews with dissident researchers. Reporters who wish to cover this controversy have been openly threatened by the government officials, and government officials have even made offers of money and other incentives to induce dissenting scientists to change their minds and return to the establishment. In a handful of cases, this pressure has succeeded in silencing researchers. But for one that caves in, dozens more the growing ranks of skeptics against the AIDS party line. To break through this blockade, scientist and author Bryan J. Ellison wrote the book, Why We Will Never Win the War on AIDS. This book is a thorough review of the AIDS controversy, explained clearly for non-scientific readers, which not only explains what really causes AIDS, but also documents disasters of falsely blaming other diseases on viruses, which people engineered the war on AIDS, and how the government has conducted its campaign of censorship. Not surprisingly, Ellison ran into the same wall when trying to publish his book. Although editors at several major publishing houses acknowledged the bestseller potential of the book, Most refused to take it. One publisher finally did sign a contract and then changed its mind several months later, deciding that the book was too controversial to publish. One final publisher picked up the book, also signing a contract for its publication, and also dropped the book a few months afterwards. Realizing the book would never appear with any major publisher, Ellison finally began publishing it himself. At that point came the most surprising development of all. Another publisher, Regnery Publishing of Washington, D.C., purchased the dead contract from one of the publishers that had dropped the book and demanded that Ellison immediately stop publishing the book and destroy all remaining copies. Regnery Publishing, moreover, refused to publish the book. When Ellison continued publishing, Regnery sued in federal court on the opposite side of the country. As it turned out, the president of Regnery Publishing was himself a former top official of the U.S. Justice Department, as was his attorney, and breaking an amazing number of federal laws while openly siding with Regnery. The judge forced through a verdict against Ellison and, on November 30th, 1995, signed an order banning the book nationwide. Why We Will Never Win the War on AIDS is now totally unavailable and cannot even be distributed for free. Ellison is currently appealing this shocking decision, but it is not known when or if. Bryan Ellison was trained in the doctoral program at the University of California at Berkeley in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology. He has done research on both cancer and AIDS and has published 3 scientific studies on these topics. However, when faculty members at the university discovered that Ellison had written this book on the AIDS debate, they punished him by expelling him for lack of progress shortly before he could write and file his PhD thesis. Mr. Ellison has written articles and given speeches on topics ranging from AIDS to international terrorism and has made presentations to scientific meetings. He has been interviewed for a variety of publications and on numerous radio programs and has also appeared on such television programs as ABC's Nightline. The following lecture by Mr. Ellison is sponsored and distributed by the Save the AIDS Book Legal Defense Fund, now that the book is illegal.
I'm here today to present to you a controversy that is the greatest medical controversy, certainly of the last 10 or 15 years, and probably of the 20th century. It's a controversy that has now brought in hundreds of top scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, Nobel Prize winners, top people at Yale and Harvard, the University of California, and all over the world. Some of the very top people in the areas of virology, epidemiology, molecular biology, actually Latin. The point is that those are the very fields involved at the forefront of AIDS research. So these are the top scientists in the world, very prestigious, very respectable people with top grants from top agencies, who now believe that we may have gotten it all wrong in our war on AIDS. We may have blamed AIDS on the wrong cause. That is to say that in 1984, when Dr. Robert Gallo of the National Institutes of Health of the United States federal government declared that the virus HIV, that he simply may have been dead wrong, and we've been barking up the wrong tree in trying to fight AIDS, treat it, prevent it, or deal with it in any way, shape, or form. And yet to this day we've now spent some probably $40 billion just through the U.S. federal government alone, and this money has of course created a huge AIDS industry, an AIDS lobby, and a lot of scientists who are committed to this view, and it's very difficult to back out. And this is why this controversy, albeit people behind it, nevertheless you haven't been hearing about it on the front pages of the New York Times or on CBS or NBC or your nightly news or anything like that. Possibly you may have come across some articles on it or seen a couple of little things here and there, but basically it has not reached the public at large. And so what I'm going to do is tonight I'm going to be giving you a little background on this monumental controversy. And what that means is I'll be spending about certainly on the virus hunters and the fact that this AIDS epidemic is not only not the first time that scientists have blamed a disease on a virus falsely, naming the wrong virus, the wrong cause, but in fact, in the past it has caused tremendous disaster, medical and social disaster. Lives have been lost, and it was done for many of the same reasons that we have misplaced the blame with the AIDS epidemic today. To understand the medical scientists and researchers for infectious basis of disease, for germs as the cause of disease, you actually have to go back about 200 years to the days of scurvy. Now, I assume that most of you probably remember what scurvy is, at least from school. Scurvy is the vitamin C deficiency that leads to gum diseases and then eventually to other problems with skin and internal organs, soft tissues, finally nervous system, then dementia, and finally death when taken far enough. And of course this disease developed, it's a vitamin C deficiency, so it developed, for example, among sailors who were sailing on the high seas and who had access to nothing but bacon, salted meats, and some other dried out food. So they wouldn't get their vitamin C intake, they would develop this disease. However, it was assumed starting at least in the early 1700s that scurvy was an infectious disease. Because you see, one sailor on a ship would come down with scurvy, and before you knew it, other sailors were coming down with scurvy. So he had spread the miasms or the evil spirits or the bad airs. In those days they didn't have germs as the basis of infectious disease, but he was already spreading it to his fellow shipmates. Of course, they'd all been eating the same diet, that's why they would all start getting sick. But it was assumed to be infectious because the infectious basis of disease puts a lot of fear into people and can cause people to act very irrationally. So the story, as a matter of fact, I won't go into all the details. These were in the book that I wrote, but that there were some of the very famous leaders of the British Navy, and so of course declared openly that this is an infectious disease, and it was treated accordingly. They would attempt to deal with it by opening the windows on the ship and letting pure air in, or as in the ever-famous story that actually led to the discovery of the cure for scurvy. One sailor, one time on a British ship returning home in about the mid-1700s, developed scurvy, began acting crazy. It became a very well-developed case of scurvy. The other sailors were, of course, terrified, so he was marooned on the nearest island on the way back to England. By the time he was on the island, he was crawling around on the beaches and eating shellfish and snails and grass, whatever happened to be around. But there was enough vitamin C in those elements, in those foods that he was eating, that he was able to recover from scurvy, and by the time the next ship came by, he was there waving at ready to be picked up. So of course he was quite a sensation upon returning to England. Dr. James Lind, Royal Surgeon or Doctor for the British Navy, was fascinated by this case and decided that in this recovery lay the key to understanding the cause and cure of scurvy. He conducted 30 or 40 years worth of experiments playing around with the diets on British ships, and eventually discovered that you could cure and prevent scurvy 100% of the time with some magical ingredient present primarily in, of course in general, fruits and vegetables or even fresh meats, but also in particular in citrus fruits. And so the British Navy, in response to Dr. Lind's absolutely breathtakingly clear scientific rational research, perhaps the dawning of the modern era in science, in response to this, required from that time forward that all sailors, certainly in the British Navy and I believe also in the Merchant Marine, were required to carry lemon and lime juices on board, and thus became known as limeys, and that to this day is the reason we call British sailors limeys, so as to prevent scurvy. This discovery from the British Admiralty came down in the 1790s. You would think the problem was solved at this point. And yet, nonetheless, all of the top medical and biological research scientists and medical doctors, physicians throughout Europe and throughout the world, including in England, all of them continue to maintain that scurvy was nevertheless an infectious disease. And in fact, Dr. Lind's published, very public, very available research was simply swept out of the way and quickly forgotten. By the 1840s, you had such paramount researchers at leading institutions like the Paris Academy of Medicine, such paramount researchers as Jean-Antoine Viamin, who was declaring openly that we can say for sure that scurvy is indeed infectious because it breaks out in clusters in prisons or on ships. That is to say, one guy gets it, soon others get it. Well, there's lesson number one for this lecture here on determining whether a disease is caused by a germ, and that is that when something breaks out in clusters, it is not evidence at all that you have an infectious disease, quite the opposite. An infectious disease always breaks out of clusters, spreads into the general population, affects everybody, young and old, male and female, does not discriminate in general. Certainly, some people can be healthier than others, but basically, it's going to cut across the population. A disease that remains clustered is necessarily a non-infectious disease. That is a disease that is not caused by germs. And thus, this is a situation when you see a disease break out in clusters and remain in clusters, it's a sure sign that you are in fact dealing with a non-infectious disease. But this was, of course, not thought about very carefully. The idea was if it's in clusters, it's going to spread. This is the same kind of mistake that was later made with the AIDS epidemic. So the treatment and the prevention of scurvy continued on an infectious basis throughout the 1800s, in the Crimean War coming into the 20th century, also in World War I. As late as that, soldiers at the front lines who had developed scurvy were quarantined and separated from the other soldiers. The treatments were the standard antibiotics of the day, which just happened to be mercury and arsenic and quinine and strychnine. Don't think that's too funny. They did, in fact, kill germs. And those were antibiotics, without a doubt. Of course, they tended to kill the patient, too. But doctors swore by the results of these drugs. And so the treatment and the prevention were, in fact, causing a lot of the problem with scurvy. The measures to control scurvy actually led to outbreaks of scurvy. For example, right around the turn of the century, around 1900, there was an epidemic, a growing epidemic of scurvy among babies. The reason was, unknown to researchers at the time, was that the process of pasteurization was in fact going on to boil the milk and get rid of germs. And this was also destroying the vitamin C in the milk, so that the babies were getting milk without vitamin C and were starting to develop scurvy by the hundreds and then by the thousands in Europe. And the American Pediatric Association quickly did a study at this time. They did notice the connection to the milk. They could see that something having to do with the milk was related to scurvy. But their conclusion was that it wasn't that the milk was being pasteurized and thus some nutritional ingredient was being destroyed, but rather that the milk wasn't being pasteurized hot enough and hard enough so that the deadly scurvy bacteria was getting through. So, of course, they boiled it all the hotter and harder, and scurvy continued to spread like wildfire among American and European babies. Now, you have to understand at this time that the successes of Drs. Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur in France and Germany were in discovering germs now as the basis of infectious disease, had inspired a whole generation of microbiologists, medical researchers, and scientists who were coming out of the medical schools and who wanted to find germs as the basis of disease, because Robert Koch had successfully isolated the tuberculosis bacillus as the cause of tuberculosis, which it is. You can prove it using a set of tests known as Koch's postulates. But at this time, scientists now wanted to isolate these new germs, these bacteria, as the cause of everything. Vitamin deficiencies, probably tennis elbow, certainly everything they could get their hands on, they would isolate a germ. And so you could, in these scurvy patients, in fact, quite a number of germs were being isolated. In fact, every single laboratory seemed to come up with a different bacterium and said, this is the cause of scurvy. This is the cause of scurvy. The reason was, and here's lesson number 2, is that in your bodies and in mine, every person is filled with germs, bacteria, viruses, whatever, plenty of germs, most of which cause no disease at all. The fact is that the great majority of microbes out there that we're contacting every day cause nothing. We know the exceptions by name because of the terrible diseases they cause. Measles, polio, flu, herpes, hepatitis. These are exceptions. But the vast majority of right now cause nothing at all. And you've never noticed the diseases, and therefore you don't even have a name for these viruses. It wasn't until the last 20 or 30 years we even had the technology to know that these viruses exist or to isolate them. At this time, bacteria were easier to isolate than viruses, and so plenty of bacteria were being found. And so if you want to say that a certain disease is caused by a certain bacterium, all you have to do is go to the patient and start poking around the lymph nodes or the blood or somewhere, and you're going to find plenty of bacteria, and you'll find new bacteria. And you'll be able to say this is the cause or this is the cause. So lesson number 2 is that it's always possible to isolate a germ from anyone sick or healthy. That doesn't tell you anything. You need to have actual scientific standards by which you say this germ causes this disease. And that's what Koch's postulates were all about, and we'll be explaining that a little bit later. With scurvy, it continued to spread, continued to be maltreated until the 1930s. It was not until modern biochemistry, or really just organic chemistry, made it possible to isolate and crystallize ascorbate, the vitamin C compound itself, and prove that even the tiniest amounts of it could cure and prevent scurvy 100% of the time. And finally, with that advance, it was now clear. Even the microbe hunters at that point lost their interest in the germs and acknowledged scurvy was caused by vitamin deficiency, which we know to this day. But it was definitely delayed for at least 150 years, that discovery, because of the search for germs. And that's the conclusion many scientists now reach. But they don't teach this anymore in the medical textbooks in school because it's simply too embarrassing an episode. But it was hardly isolated. The vitamin deficiency of pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency. This is something that niacin's a B-class vitamin. Niacin's found in green vegetables, not so much in corn, at least not natively. Niacin deficiencies lead to rough skin or splotches on the skin, thus the name pellagra, which is Italian for rough skin, and eventually dementia and death and all of the nervous system problems. Now, pellagra spread wherever corn-based diets spread, originally showing up, well, in various parts of Europe, but let's particularly note in Italy in the late 1800s, where corn became the basis of the diet and where it was becoming a substitute for the green vegetables that contained niacin. No one knew about niacin at the time, but immediately, and this was at the time in the 1880s, where the first microbes had been isolated as the cause of infectious disease, every scientist wanted to find bacteria that caused pellagra. And every lab was coming up with bacteria. The craze was spreading everywhere. One Louis Sambon in England on a pellagra commission actually decided that pellagra was airborne or insect-borne. In fact, he came up with a very fanciful hypothesis of how mosquitoes would pick it up from somebody and carry it to animals, and another mosquito would bite the animal, and maybe the fly would pick it up and finally spread it to another human. So you had to take extra precautions to prevent yourself from catching pellagra. And again, the reasoning was the same. It seems to break out in clusters and this kind of thing. The connection to corn was sometimes noticed, so it was assumed, of course, by these microbe hunters, not that it was nutritional, but that there was a bacterium in the corn. And so they simply couldn't let go of microbes. Everyone was racing to be able to be the first to develop the treatment, the prevention, the vaccine, get the Nobel Prize, make the money, and of course the public germs. You can't see germs, they're very tiny, so it was a very scary idea. The epidemic of pellagra hit the United States beginning in 1905. By the 1910s, it had reached a level of over 200,000 Americans cumulatively, which was as large as the AIDS epidemic was only about 4 years ago. So in fact, this was a major and devastating epidemic in the United States, mostly in the southern United States, amongst populations that ate cornbread and molasses as the mainstay of their diets. This, of course, was fairly niacin deficient. So in certain groups, clusters of people living primarily in the South, we began to see pellagra. 2 national commissions on pellagra were formed. A whole battery of scientific researchers sent by the federal government to find out what was going on. Every one of them looked for germs, one after another after another. Some were more honest and would try to inject the germs in animals to see, of course they were isolating plenty of germs from pellagra patients, but would inject them into monkeys or other animals to see if they could cause pellagra in the animals. When nothing happened, they were honest enough to say, I'm not sure we've got the right germ. Other labs were far less scrupulous and said, this is the right germ, and another one would say, this one. The treatment for pellagra was, of course, mercury and arsenic and strychnine as the leading antibiotics of the day. And quarantine was a very common procedure for prevention. So in fact, in sanitaria and in various asylums and hospitals around the country, pellagra patients were isolated and kept quarantined so as not to be able to infect the rest of the population. The New York Times was at the leading edge of this campaign at the time. They pushed the idea that this was infectious, and if we don't do something to prevent infection, including by stable flies or house flies or insects, airborne transmission, then we were all going to be doomed. So the New York Times was beating the drum saying we've got to do something to control the pellagra germs and find what that germ is. Now finally, in the midst of all this absolute insanity came one Dr. Joseph Goldberger from the Public Health Service of the United States. He was cut from a different cloth. He didn't go along with the bureaucracy that had hired him. And in fact, he was only promoted because his predecessors had all resigned finally in absolute frustration that they couldn't definitively find the germ that caused pellagra. He showed up, and it took him all of maybe a few weeks at the absolute maximum to realize what caused pellagra. All he did was he went into the hospitals, or the quarantine facilities, where the patients and the healthcare workers were, and he noticed the difference. The patients were eating cornbread and molasses, and the healthcare workers were eating normal diets, and the healthcare workers, and here's lesson number 3 for this lecture, is that in no case did any healthcare worker contract pellagra from any of the patients. Now you see, healthcare workers are on the front line of disease. They're treating patients. There are some 5 million healthcare workers in the United States today dealing with hundreds of millions of patients. They are at the front line of disease. If there's something infectious out there, be it flu or herpes or hepatitis, they are the first to get everybody else. And any disease that does not transmit from the patients to the healthcare workers is absolutely guaranteed not to be infectious. Dr. Goldberger realized this, and when he saw there was no transmission to the healthcare workers who were changing these people's clothes and feeding them and taking care of them and everything else, he knew this was not infectious. He looked at the diet, realized the difference in diet, spent several months playing around with the diets until he figured out which foods were rich in whatever substance it was that was missing. He didn't know the name, didn't know what it was, but he knew which foods could cure. He went through this whole thing and actually experimented on the patients, both prisoners in the prisons and also patients in the hospitals, and had a perfect success rate in terms of curing and preventing pellagra. Well, you would think that this would have earned him a Nobel Prize. The problem is that one's career in science is subject to one's peers, and his peers were not happy with this because he was blowing away their entire war against microbes, searching for the germs. In fact, the medical establishment began attacking him. The Thompson-McFadden Medical Commission was established specifically to discredit Dr. Goldberger, to mock him and to attack him. The New York Times called him pernicious and irresponsible because if Americans listened to Dr. Goldberger's advice, why, they wouldn't take precautions to protect themselves from flies, and they'd think that just by eating food they could somehow save themselves from the deadly pellagra epidemic. So Dr. Goldberger was going to be responsible for millions of dead people. In the meantime, the national conferences on pellagra, 2 were held. One actually at one point condemned Dr. Goldberger. Finally, some of the scientists retracted that, but the pressure was getting very hot and very heavy. In frustration, Dr. Goldberger, his wife, and 14 co-workers finally decided to prove once and for all this is not an infectious disease. They took the bodily fluids of a number of pellagra patients and injected themselves with it. Now, they may have caught some diseases at that time, but one disease they did not catch was pellagra. Now, you would think that would have settled it. No, that didn't stop. The news media and the medical establishment, the U.S. government, continued to wage their campaign against Dr. Goldberger all the way to his death in the 1920s. It was not until several years after his death niacin was finally isolated and crystallized and proven to be the absolute cure and prevention for pellagra. So Dr. Goldberger was vindicated after his death, but the microbe hunters, of course, had issued no apologies. They just swept it under the rug. Similar things happened with beriberi. I won't get into all the details. Beriberi is a thiamine deficiency. This is also a B-class vitamin. There was a major search on from the late 1800s forward to find the germ that causes beriberi. It was occurring largely among the colonial Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, in Indonesia, who were eating polished rice diets. Polished rice removes the husks. It's no longer the brown rice. That means the thiamine is gone, And so in not eating the nice refined white rice, or in some cases like in France when we saw beriberi outbreaks, it was white bread. These days all those vitamins are put back in, but those days they didn't know about the vitamins. So the Dutch got to eat the polished rice, the natives had to eat the crude brown rice, but the natives never got beriberi. Only the Dutch colonials got beriberi. That should have been a clue. If anything, the disease should have spread to the natives if it were infectious. Nevertheless, the Dutch government and all other European governments in the United States all assumed and continue to assume that beriberi was caused by germs. They isolated one bacterium after another, fungi, even a virus at one point, just when viruses were first being discovered. One Dr. Christian Eichmann from Holland went down to the Dutch East Indies to experiment, specifically to try to find the germ. He was trained as a microbiologist. His training was in finding germs, and he was looking for germs that caused beriberi. And through an accident, he noticed that there was an accidental observation when the polished rice was fed to the chickens, and all of a sudden they developed beriberi, and then he realized what was going on. He actually did experiments, careful, clear, solid scientific experiments proving prisoners in Dutch prisons and people in hospitals, everyone could be cured of beriberi by feeding them brown rice instead of polished rice and certain other foods. Nevertheless, he was ordered in by his superiors, who ordered him to suppress his results, and in fact he did, in order to keep his career going. His papers were not, that was in the 1900s, 1910s. His papers were not rediscovered until 20 or 30 years later when Feynman was finally isolated and crystallized. Once again, people have been treated with all kinds of toxic drugs and quarantined and to try to prevent the spread of deadly beriberi. So we're dealing with a continuing obsession that these microbes hunters have with blaming diseases on germs and with using very faulty reasoning in order to establish this. This has come down to more modern times. I'll give an example here. In Japan in the 1950s and 60s, there was an epidemic that broke out. It resembled polio to some extent in that it started with stomach problems and then would in many cases lead to peripheral neuropathies. That means damage to the peripheral nerves, blindness, paralysis, even death. And by the time the epidemic was over in 1970, 11,000 victims had been hit. Now, it grew slowly at first and then accelerated throughout the 1960s, ultimately leading to panic when the Japanese public believed that they were all going to be infected, and the Japanese news media, in fact, the world news media, pushed very hard this idea that we had a dead disease here. Some great number of labs and 2 or 3 separate commissions were formed by the Japanese government and their National Institute of Health looking for the viruses that caused SMON, as it was called. The name was SMON, S-M-O-N, subacute myelooptic neuropathy. So in other words, referring to the blindness. But you don't have to remember that name. You won't be quizzed on it later. SMON, S-M-O-N, had an acronym very much like AIDS. And it was thought to be infectious. It was noticed but not paid attention to that it was not, it would hit some healthcare workers, but it stayed carefully confined within certain kind of clusters and had very odd risk groups. For example, middle-aged women were hit particularly hard. Now, middle-aged women are not usually the first risk group you think of for infectious diseases. They're not going to get the venereal diseases first. They're not as exposed to the public. They don't get the flus necessarily first. They're not going to be getting hepatitis first. They just don't get the infectious diseases first, and yet they were the ones bearing the brunt of the disease. Also, it seemed to be clustered, but it didn't quite break out into the general population. Furthermore, there was a correlation noticed that the patients who developed SMON also tended to have a pre-existing disorder, a gastrointestinal disorder, amoebic dysentery very often, stomach problems that then could develop into SMON, but it seemed to be a separate thing. So there were certain correlations noticed but not paid attention to. At least a dozen viruses were isolated and blamed as the cause of the SMON epidemic. And then for the second time, there was a time in the early 60s, early to mid-60s, where one intrepid scientific researcher noticed that essentially all of the patients that he had with SMON could be confirmed to have used a particular prescription drug. Its generic name is clyoquinol. Its brand name was enterovioform. It was an amoebic, anti-amoebic agent. It was taken, the idea was that you swallow it, it goes through your stomach and kills the amoebae, dysentery problems. It was being widely prescribed in Japan at the time. Its prescription and spread was growing. It was not used so much in any other country in the world for various reasons. And this drug was assumed that it couldn't cause anything because it wasn't absorbed into the body. It was supposed to go just through the guts and out. But in any case, most of the patients had been using this drug. The connection was noticed again finally in 1970. Virus hunters who were a little more honest than the rest, even after all the great momentum and push for searching for the virus, and noticed again that virtually all the patients had green coatings on their tongues and green urine, which is not your everyday occurrence. It turned out that these were residues of the drug chloroquinol, and therefore that virtually all the patients, it turns out, were taking this prescription drug chloroquinol. When the connection was clearly established, the Japanese government banned the drug chloroquinol in August of 1970. Within 30 days, the entire epidemic, which had been rising steadily for 15 years, dropped off and disappeared forever, has never been back. It turns out it was caused by a prescription drug prescribed by doctors for a different condition, and this is why stomach problems would lead to the SMON. The drug, as it turns out, we now know, was being absorbed into the body. It was damaging the nervous system. It could injure, it could kill, permanently cripple. In animals, it will cause the SMON syndrome, and all of this was proved. And yet, to this day, the whole thing, of course, collapsed into, it was a panic in the Japanese news. By 1970, before the drug was banned, the entire Japanese public was afraid that they were all going to catch the SMON virus and die. Members of families were ostracized and thrown out, and there was great panic. And then when the whole thing collapsed, there were, of course, thousands of families who now began suing the government, and a number of years later, late in the 70s, finally the whole lawsuit, with lawsuits and class action lawsuits, hundreds of millions of dollars in liability and so forth, the whole incident ended. However, to this day, believe it or not, the virus hunting mania is so intense that scientists in Japan, as well as to some extent in Europe and the United States, are reviving the idea that a virus caused this now extinct SMON epidemic. So the virus hunters simply would not let go. So with the SMON epidemic, which followed the polio epidemic, was really the reason it occurred was that it followed in the wake of the polio epidemic, and polio was the last great infectious disease of the Western world. For you see, even just 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago, but even 100 years ago, the leading cause of death among Americans and Europeans was tuberculosis, which is infectious. It's caused by a bacterium. Second cause of death, I don't remember in order, but after that came cholera and malaria and various other diseases. Today in the third world, the leading cause of death is malaria. Second is tuberculosis, and after that follows a whole laundry list of infectious diseases. But in the last 100 years especially, a very distinct and rapid change in the health profile of Western industrial populations took place. That is, in Western industrial Europe and in the United States, the life expectancy of the average person increased from maybe 40, 45 years up to now pushing 80 years and still growing. That's the average life expectancy. If you're born today, you can expect to live 75 to 80 years, depending on whether you're male or female. Women live a little longer than men, but pushing 80 years. So we've had very nearly a doubling in our life expectancy just in the last 100 years. And that doubling took place as the infectious diseases only in the industrial world disappeared. That is to say, tuberculosis went away, polio, measles, yellow fever, all of these things disappeared, so that today, and in fact as of 1960 when polio finally disappeared, infectious disease became the cause of less than 1% of death in the Western world. Today the leading cause of death is heart disease, followed by cancer of all varieties combined, so that these are distinctly non-infectious diseases. And they're diseases of older age. That is to say, we no longer die when we're very young of infectious disease. We now live to be old enough to get the diseases of old age. So what a blessing, actually, ironically, to be able to get heart disease and cancer instead of infectious disease. Why this is debated. Epidemiologists will argue anything from medical advances, even though that is, in fact, in many cases disputable, all the way to just general standards of living in the industrial world, maybe even psychology, mentality, better diets, better access to whatever For whatever reason, and this is debated back and forth, I'm not going to get into that issue today, why do we live longer, but the fact is we now have basically healthier immune systems. We're able to resist disease more readily. The flu in 1918 killed something like at least 500,000 Americans. Some people estimate several million Americans. The flu, this was the flu season, you see, and in the flu season it simply killed a tremendous number of people. Today that doesn't happen. The flu is miserable, you don't like the flu, but you're not going to die from it. Many people can be infected with the flu virus and never get sick. We all know that. The flu comes through our families. Some people get sick, some don't. Everyone was infected. But it's not that the people who didn't get sick weren't infected. They just had a stronger immune system that resisted the virus early on. So infectious disease has disappeared. But in the third world, where industry has not yet hit very strongly, although infectious disease is starting to come down in certain ways and life expectancy is starting to come up in proportion to where industry shows up. Nevertheless, overall now their life expectancy is still generally under 50 years and they die primarily of infectious disease. Very little heart disease or cancer because they don't live to be old enough to get that. Now consider this problem for the microbe hunters. The age of viruses and bacteria and all the deadly infectious diseases ended in 1960. It was already largely over by the 30s and 40s and absolutely ended in 1960 with the polio epidemic. It was the end of it. So the question was where to go from here. You now had thousands of top scientists who had been trained as virus hunters. Now you see a transition took place right during the middle of the polio epidemic, which by the way that epidemic was the result of soldiers in World War II. We'd had polio already but had not been an epidemic. Soldiers in World War II returning from the Pacific Theater from Burma and other places fighting the Japanese brought back with them polio, and so for about 10 years it was a sort of a modest-sized epidemic in the United States. But again, it disappeared by 1960 for reasons that are still debated, generally credited to the vaccines. Polio is of course caused by a virus. But at this point, in the middle of this polio epidemic following World War II, there was a change that took place in the federal government that was to seal our fate for many decades to come. It was one of those flukes of history, perhaps, but President Eisenhower, in a situation where there was a shakeup, a political shakeup at the National Institutes of Health, which had been a tiny backwater federal agency, very little funding, no influence, many scientists never even heard of it. It financed a little agricultural research or something like that, virtually nothing. But there was a shakeup at several federal agencies, and the NIH had been sponsoring the polio vaccine project, which was probably the biggest thing they'd been involved with. There was a problem that developed, there was a shakeup. A new man named James Shannon was appointed by President Eisenhower to take over. He had the dream of building the largest scientific super bureaucracy in the history of the world. His idea was more science means better science. More money means more scientists, means more data, means more progress, because he equated science with progress and data with science and money with data. The only question all that, more money does hire more scientists and does generate more data, and science has meant progress. The problem is right in the middle of that equation, in that more data does not mean more scientific progress. Science is essentially a process of interpreting the old data. Einstein never did a single experiment in his entire life on relativity. He never gathered a single data point. He took the data that already existed before 1905 and simply reinterpreted it. He gave it a new interpretation. We call that the theory of relativity, both the special and general theory. Same thing happened with Isaac Newton. Although he performed experiments later in life, his basic formulation of the laws of mechanics and gravity he did based on pre-existing data that everyone was well familiar with, and that was his great advance, was reinterpreting that data. Galileo discovered, like Copernicus, centrism, that the planets go around the sun and not the sun and the planets around the earth. Again, he did this by interpreting the old data. Again and again and again, all of the great scientific advances have been by realizing that the old data didn't add up to what everyone already believed it added up to. It meant something different. There was a simpler, better, cleaner, more sensible explanation for the data. You develop, in fact, the reverse problem when you begin to pay too many data collecting experimentalists to begin to gather in vast sums of observations. What you do is you create a huge mountain of raw data, and nobody can possibly sift through it or begin to interpret it. On top of that, you begin to hire in enormous numbers of scientists who now are in there for the money, for the career, because it's a good, safe job. You can get paid a good amount just to gather data all day long. It doesn't require much brain power. and you might even get some prizes and be thought of as a very intelligent person. So you began to flood the sciences with people who were very different from Einstein or Newton or Pascal or Newton or Galileo or Copernicus. These were fundamentally new breed of people. These were bureaucrats, they were data collectors. They're not interested in science. And I can say that with some personal experience, having worked now in academia, and I worked in there for 5 years in the graduate school environment, University of California at Berkeley, Department of Molecular and Cell Biology, right in the middle of sort of the hub of this kind of thing. And I can tell you that very few professors in the department had even the slightest interest in science. And I will say that quite bluntly. Now, grows, not only do you have too much to interpret, and most of it being absolutely useless, and a good scientist would have known that right away, not even bothered collecting it, but beyond that, you have the problem that now you've got the herd mentality. One scientist who tries to speak up and say, wait, you know, this data adds up to something else, is going to be driven out of the profession by his hordes and hordes of new peers he never had before. You have a herd effect. It's like lemmings. They're all stampeding in one direction, and how can one lemming resist any longer? You can't go against the crowd. It's just... So, with James Shannon's changes, when he came in as director of the National Institutes of Health, appointed by Eisenhower, when he equated more data and more scientists with more and better science and more progress, he basically was modeling the program after the Manhattan Project, which had spent $2 billion of 1940s money, which you can imagine what that would be today, $2 billion of 1940s currency, and had constructed the nuclear bomb. And shortly after that, and it was already being talked about, we had send up satellites, and then we had the Apollo moon landing, which was based on a similar kind of a concept. Throw a huge amount of money at an engineering problem, figure out a way to solve the problem, and go do it, and make the nuclear bomb, put a man on the moon. The problem is that for biology or for basic science, this doesn't work. You can, if you put enough money in, engineer a solution to something if you already understand the laws of physics. But if you don't know what the cause of cancer is, and you don't know what the cause of AIDS is, or any other disease, heart disease, if you're not sure, more money and more data does not help you understand that. Once you know the cause, more money could help you develop a solution. But we don't know the causes of these diseases, as much as scientists will try to tell you otherwise, which is why we have not cured these diseases. Had we understood the causes, we most likely would have cured those diseases by now. Absolutely, with the amount of money that the federal government is spending. James Shannon made friends with key congressmen on Capitol Hill and began to arrange for massive increases in funding to the National Institutes of Health. Its budget took off starting fiscal year 1956 on to the present day. Its budget has increased only exponentially, constantly. Never once has it been cut, never once has it even leveled off, even after adjusting for inflation. It has grown faster than the gross national product, faster than inflation, faster than your incomes. The NIH just continues to expand and expand. They spend the money to train more scientists like myself who will go back, and every year they reserve some of the money to train new scientists who will go back and now become scientists and file grant proposals. So no matter how much money you put in the year before, there will always be more demand for money the next year. So every year there's a shortage of money no matter how much you increase the budget. And this turned out to be just an absolute engine of pork barrel projects, creating a huge science establishment that was no longer capable of interpreting data. No longer capable of it. If someone decided this is what the data means, the whole herd is going to run in that direction, and there's nothing that can stop it at that point. And because this took place in 1955, the money began to come in under the war on polio. So of course the people trained with it were poliovirologists, polio virus hunters, whose only technique was to study viruses. That's all they knew. They were hammers looking for nails. When polio disappeared in 1960, and when there were no other infectious diseases serious enough to merit a national program after that, the next frontier was cancer. And here you had hammers looking for nails, virus hunters who now were dispatched to study cancer in a growing science establishment that has become absolutely huge. By the way, I should mention that the NIH, to give you an idea of how large it has grown and how large science has grown since World War II and since the changes in the 1950s, you should now understand that as opposed to just a few dozen or a few hundred scientific journals before, we now have tens of thousands of scientific journals worldwide. We have 1.5 million research papers generated every year, nearly 500,000 active research scientists in the United States alone. The National Institutes of Health, the funding it provides to universities, is more than the combined total provided by the federal government for all areas of physics, science, sociology, social sciences, humanities, math, art, liberal sciences, everything combined. NIH money alone, and that's not the only agency that funds biomedical research. Biomedical research is by far the runaway dominant department now on every major college campus. As the joke goes, when the NIH sneezes, the academic community catches cold. So they control the universities now, and the money is in there, and it's a massive, massive scientific establishment, absolutely huge. It's larger, the statistic was in the late already, of every 8 scientists who lived in the history of the world in any place, in any empire or civilization, 7 were alive and doing research in 1969. And that was already 69. Today it's just far worse. So the vast majority of scientists who've ever lived on the planet are alive right now doing research. That's the simple fact. We have a voluminous thing that's never been seen before in the history of the world. Now, polio was over, cancer comes along. What do you think these well-trained virus hunters looked for to blame cancer on? You guessed it, viruses, of course. There was a slight problem, though. That is to say that cancer is a relatively slow disease. Most cancer appears in older age. There's a lot of publicity given to young children who develop cancer, mostly because that tugs at the heartstrings and helps get donations. The fact is, 95% of cancer is in elderly people, in people who are over middle age. It's it is a disease of old age. And the cancers themselves will begin appearing many years early, anywhere from months to years, even decades to develop. A cancer could take 50 years to develop. If you can see it from the time you can diagnose it, could take 50 years. It might never become full-fledged. You might never die of that cancer, but you could be having a cancer slowly progressing over 50 years of your life, and then you die of something totally unrelated at age 90. So this is the state of cancer. It's a very slow developing disease. Viruses, on the other hand, are very fast. They infect you today. They spread throughout the body, take over, cause a disease within hours or days or weeks of when you were first infected. And you will either get sick immediately or not at all. Your immune system at this point makes the antibodies that now eliminate the virus from the body. You have the white blood cell response, you have the antibody response, and either that virus will kill you if you, for some reason you're going to die of an infection. Most likely, if you're going to get sick at all, the immune system will now knock out the virus, and once the virus is gone, once you have only the antibodies left, you're immunized for life. This is essentially what's called natural. So you're fine after that. So how do you reconcile a fast virus that's going to make you sick within a few days and then you'll be over it, which is how viruses operate. They multiply while they have the chance before your immune system knocks it out, versus a cancer that's going to be developing ever so slowly over a number of years? Well, the solution was to come up with something called the slow virus, literally slowing down those viruses so they could now fit cancer. One Dr. Carlton Gajdusek actually developed this idea in the late 1950s. He blamed an obscure disease called kuru among natives in the highlands of Papua New Guinea who were developing some sort of brain degenerative disease that took about a year or more to develop and die. He claimed that it was caused by a virus, that it was being spread by cannibalism because these people would eat each other upon their death. They didn't bury their dead, they just ate them, according to Dr. Gajdusek. And therefore they would catch these slow viruses and they themselves would have their brains rotting and so forth. Well, Dr. Gajdusek was generous enough to bestow himself on these native New Guinean people, teach them not to cannibalize. The disease disappeared, the cannibalism disappeared, the virus disappeared, all before any other scientist could come into the area to verify the existence of any of those three. In fact, Dr. Gajdusek himself never even isolated the virus. It was simply his claim that there was any kind of a virus at all. But because he invented the idea of a slow virus, which is totally unexplainable, it's never been seen, there's no reason to think that a slow virus could exist. You can't even imagine how it could exist. A virus, it's incompatible with the definition of a virus. Nevertheless, because he came up with the concept, because it now gave virus hunters a handle to be able to attach viruses to slow diseases, they awarded him the Nobel Prize in 1976 for a virus that has yet to be discovered, a phantom virus causing a phantom disease spread by phantom cannibalism that no one has ever confirmed. And in fact, there is some question he may have faked his data regarding the ritual cannibalism among the Foray tribesmen. It may never have existed. There is some evidence, or he was unable to produce the photographic evidence he claimed he had, And there is some dispute now whether whether this, the disease or the cannibalism ever existed. Nevertheless, he's a Nobel laureate, and the virus hunters moved on. So what they've done is they've blamed basically 4 main human cancers and a few smaller ones on viruses or on bacteria. The 4 main ones I'll just go over very quickly. Burkitt's lymphoma was discovered by Dennis Burkitt in Eastern Africa in the early 1960s, 1962 in fact. It's a cancer of the lymph nodes. A lymphoma is a cancer of the lymph nodes, so they grow and swell up, and the lymph tissues become cancerous. 2 years later, Doctors Epstein and Bauer in London, working on tissues extracted from the lymph nodes of Burkitt's lymphoma patients, found, heavens to Betsy, found a virus in those tissues, which they had been growing in culture for quite some time. Well, of course you're going to find viruses. In fact, the lymph node happens to be the place where, when your body is getting rid of old viruses, they all go to the lymph nodes first before they get cleaned out. So you play around with lymph node tissues, and surprise of surprises, you find a herpes class virus. It was named humbly by Doctors Epstein and Bauer the Epstein-Barr virus, and was immediately said to cause Burkitt's lymphoma with a latent period. It's the first time this was used in any serious way, especially for human diseases. A latent period of 10 years. The virus would infect you today, would multiply in the body, cause, as it turns out, a mononucleosis, the so-called yuppie flu. This does meet Koch's postulates. You could show that the Epstein-Barr virus does cause mononucleosis. Causes mononucleosis, the immune system gets rid of the virus is gone, you have nothing but antibodies left, maybe a little trace of virus out in the lymph nodes as it's being gotten rid of. 10 years later, you will now develop the terrible Burkitt's lymphoma cancer. The problem is that the vast majority of people who are infected with, or were infected with this virus throughout the world, never develop Burkitt's lymphoma, not after 10 years, not after. For that matter, quite a large number of the Burkitt's lymphoma patients have never been infected by this virus. Well, put aside all the evidence, the fact that you can't cause Burkitt's lymphoma in the lab using the virus, everything fails. Nevertheless, this is taught in medical textbooks to this day, and it is widely believed that Burkitt's lymphoma is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus with a 10-year latent period. The next one was cervical cancer. Cervical cancer was thought to be infectious since the 1800s because nuns had a lower incidence of cervical cancer. On that information, it was assumed to be sexually transmitted, and on nothing else, because nuns had a lower rate. Never mind whatever other differences nuns might have, but because they presumably had less sex, therefore it must have been sexually transmitted. On that basis, venereal viruses were searched for as the cause of cervical cancer in women. In the late 1960s, herpes simplex virus strain 2, that's genital herpes, was blamed as the cause. However, after about 10 years of research, it was clear that the majority of women, a good number who had cervical cancer, had never been infected in their entire lives by herpes simplex virus strain 2. Too many of them were showing up. Finally, even the most die-hard of virus hunters were beginning to get embarrassed. There was one paper that appeared that promoted what was called the hit-and-run hypothesis, the idea that the virus had come, had hit and run, left no traces, not even antibodies, and years later you're going to die of the cancer. Talk about untestable scientific hypotheses. How do you even test for that? How do you know that the virus was ever there if it doesn't leave a trace? So that was pretty silly, and in 1979 then a new virus was proposed, so now we had the cancer that changed viruses. First it was caused by herpes simplex virus 2, now it was caused by papillomavirus, which does cause warts. And this is the reason that genital warts are said to lead to or be a risk for cervical cancer, because they're claiming that the virus that causes genital warts also causes cervical cancer, and that genital warts are an early stage. Never mind that there is no evidence for that. Never mind that warts actually have nothing to do with cancer and histologically, medically very different. Never mind the fact that this virus can't cause this cancer in any animal, causes no equivalent cancer in humans, and that a growing number of women are coming up, a large percentage actually, maybe at least a third of women who have cervical cancer have never been infected with any strain of papillomavirus at all, never had genital warts. Nevertheless, this virus is currently considered the cause of cervical cancer. Women, your gynecologist will in fact try to test you for venereal warts, and if she finds them, she will try to tell you that you are at risk for cervical cancer. Latent period, of course, was thrown in. It was calculated as follows. Since it was assumed that women are going to be catching the papilloma virus at roughly age 20, let's call that the peak of sexual activity, And the cancer itself, being a cancer of older age, begins showing up in women who are ages 40 to 70. We'll subtract 20 from 40 to 70, and you have, yes, you guessed it, a 20 to 50-year latent period. And that is currently the very, very broad range of enormous latent periods estimated for this virus to cause cancer. Most women who have papilloma virus generally ever develop cervical cancer. Anyway, 20 to 50 years. Third one was liver cancer being blamed on the hepatitis B virus, which does cause hepatitis B, that's liver inflammation, but is said to cause liver cancer as well after it's disappeared, after your body gets rid of it, some 30 to 60 years later. I'm not even going to comment on that evidence any further. And then finally, there was the virus in search of a disease discovered by Dr. Robert Gallo in, well, actually, he claimed to discover it. Apparently, it was discovered by the Japanese. When they mailed him a sample for comparison, all of a sudden, Dr. Gallo discovered the same viruses, the same virus, complete with mistakes and all, identical to the Japanese virus. And this virus, HTLV1, as it was later named, became the virus in search of a disease. Dr. Gallo wanted it to be the cause of some kind of leukemia. He searched the world over until he found a Japanese island in which a fair number of the people there had antibodies against this virus, and a fair number of people had an adult T-cell leukemia. Thus, by geographical correlation, the virus and the disease were on the same island. He causes the disease. He didn't bother checking that the virus and the disease were in the same people, only that they were on the same island. As it turns out, they're not in the same people. There's only a partial overlap. Nevertheless, Dr. Gallo was able to patent the test for the virus, and now the Food and Drug Administration requires that the entire blood supply for the United States, 12 million blood donations per year, be tested for this virus at anywhere from $30 to $50 per test, and Dr. Gallo receives royalty on the total. So, of course, he's very well off these days, much better off than I am, for a virus that cannot be shown to cause any disease. That's the virus hunters. That's how they were dealing with the war on cancer. The war on cancer was based on a funding program through the National Institutes of Health called the Virus Cancer Program. That was the only, until a few years ago, it was the only major federal research project to determine the cause of cancer. So, in fact, no wonder we've been looking for viruses. And yet, by the 1980s, it was clear that cancer had been cured, that most cancers had not even been able to be blamed on viruses. The few that were, we didn't have vaccines for these cancers, we didn't have antibiotics, we didn't have treatments, we had no way to deal with cancer, and yet we supposedly discovered the viruses that caused them. Well, think about it. If a virus is a slow virus, if it can go latent, if it can be eliminated from the body, you have nothing but antibodies left, so your body already got rid of the virus, and yet you still get cancer. What could you possibly do to fight a deadly virus like that? You can even get rid of the virus and it doesn't do anything. The logic of this turned science upside down on its head. But today there are tens of thousands of laboratories across the United States and many more in Europe funded entirely to buy into these virus cancer views. And their whole careers are based on it. Too many Nobel Prizes and other awards have now been given for the research in this field, despite its total failure to yield results. And it's been passed off to the public as a great advance in biotechnology, but in fact there's nothing there at all. No progress against cancer. By the early 1980s, it was clear we were losing the war on cancer, and many scientists were willing to admit this now, particularly those not studying viruses. I should add also that at this point, there was, and I don't really have the time to get into this now, but there was another branch of the federal government or another part of the biomedical establishment also that had an interest, tremendous interest in viruses. That's called the Public Health Service of the United States. It has agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and the Surgeon General, who's the head of the Public Health Service, under one roof. The goal is to protect you from accidents, disease, anything that's unhealthy, protect you from smoking, protect you from allegedly drunk driving, protect you from overpopulation, and from infectious disease. These are the people who would like to force you to be vaccinated, force you to be quarantined, force you to be treated with toxic drugs every time they decide that there's a deadly epidemic coming through. Centers for Disease Control works closely with the World Health Organization out of Geneva, Switzerland, which went just earlier in 1995, went into Kitwe area of Zaire in Central Africa, claiming that there was an Ebola fever epidemic in the region, quarantined people, forcibly treated them, shut down mass gatherings, created a cordon sanitaire which independent doctors and journalists could not enter the area to confirm that Ebola fever was there. Moreover, they exaggerated Ebola fever. I've read some of the literature, or the summaries of the literature on Ebola fever. It's not nearly as deadly as the news made it. The news was talking about people bleeding everywhere and exploding and organs melting. Ebola fever isn't like that, and there's no evidence there was even an Ebola outbreak. But these people used the opportunity as a justification for various police state measures. And I wish I had more time to go into that. That is some follow-up information that if you write into us, and we'll have information at the end of this program, that you will be able to get more information sometime in the near future on this. And certainly we have some in our book, which unfortunately we can't distribute to you, as we'll explain, and you already know a little bit about. But definitely the virus hunters, and both in the public health establishment and in the National Institutes of Health, had by 1980 a very, very decided interest in scaring the public with new viruses and in finding a way to justify their old virus research. By the early 1980s, of course, these virus hunters were perfectly ready to begin having a new disease, with the war on cancer failing, and with the Public Health Service, Centers for Disease Control, having just gone through a few years earlier some of its terrible public relations disasters on Legionnaire's disease and the swine flu disaster, the flu that never appeared, but the vaccine itself killed numerous people, promoted by the Centers for Disease Control. So certainly these people had an interest in reviving the virus hunt with a new epidemic. And so it is this point that we switch to the official subject of this lecture, and that is that in a 6-month period, maybe 8-month period, beginning in late 1980, continuing into June of 1981, a series of 4 men showed up just totally unrelated to each other at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles at various doctors. There was a new doctor there, Michael Gottlieb, who just had a new machine that could count T cells. Now, T cells are one subset of the white blood cells of the immune system. They help in your immunity. They help fight off infections. And until about 1980, it was impossible to separate the T cells from the other white blood cells. You couldn't tell the difference, even in a microscope. They looked vastly too similar. Finally, a machine was developed using fluorescence and so forth. T cells from other white blood cells. It was a very, very subtle distinction. So for the first time, we could count T cells. And Dr. Gottlieb wanted to test this out. So he asked other doctors at UCLA Medical Center, forward to me any patients you have with immune deficiencies. I want to see what kind of T cell counts immune deficient people have. Do T cells disappear when your immune system is no good? Are there more T cells when your immune system is no good? What goes on? So over a period of 6 to 8 months, there were about 4 patients referred to him from various doctors. These patients didn't know each other, completely unrelated. They were 4 homosexual men. They were ages 25 to 50. They had been living the fast lane lifestyle. That is to say, they had been racking up hundreds to thousands of sexual contacts per year, often dozens in a single evening. They'd been going into the discos, the bathhouses, the sex clubs, and so forth, and going through all of the lifestyle associated with that particular lifestyle, which is a subset of the homosexual community, involves tremendous amounts of drug abuse. That is to say, if you're going to have 10 or 20 or 45, I've even found out about, sexual contacts in a single evening, well, you need cocaine and amphetamines, methamphetamines, and so forth to get going. Then you're going to have poppers, a special drug used almost exclusively by these homosexuals. It doesn't have any hallucinogenic properties. It doesn't produce a high, but it does facilitate anal intercourse. And also similarly, ethyl chloride, which is a derivative of an old anesthetic. Wind down at the end of the evening, you need downers and, I don't know, maybe heroin or whatever. But there's going to be quite a mix of drugs. And so these fast lane homosexuals were using tremendous numbers of drugs, and the drug craze for them had begun in the early 1970s and was taking off, and by that time was almost 10 years old, 8 to 10 years. And these men showed up, and they were very immune deficient. They had pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Now, pneumocystis carinii is apparently a fungus. It's a germ present in the lungs of every child on the face of this planet. The moment you're born, it enters your lungs. It's just everywhere. It's ubiquitous. In most of us, it causes nothing at all. But if you have no immune system, your immune system keeps it in check all your life, and you know, you're just not going to have to worry about it. But if you're immune deficient for any reason, for example, severely malnourished, you're an orphan after a war under harsh conditions, taking cancer chemotherapeutic drugs, for example, which directly destroy the immune system, in the hopes of battling cancer, immune system, or for other reasons. If you are severely immune suppressed, the Pneumocystis carinii germ can take over the lungs and create a very serious and even a fatal pneumonia. And it has been seen before in all age groups and risk groups and so forth, but it's not terribly common at most times when you have a healthy, typical peacetime capitalist society. These men, all four, had Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. They had Kaposi sarcoma, a cancer of the blood vessels that creates reddish and purplish splotches on. They had candidiasis, which is a yeast infection orally in the esophagus and even in the mouth and so forth. So they were in pretty bad shape, and it turned out they had very few T cells, according to Dr. Gottlieb's device. Now, Dr. Gottlieb realized right away that this was a hot new epidemic that might interest some agencies of the federal government. It was a new disease, you see, and they're always looking for new diseases, anything that shows up. There are quite a few diseases every year, but anything that looks spectacular, they go for. It's a good publicity device. The federal agencies can ride to the rescue and save us all from. So Dr. Gottlieb contacted a local agent of the Centers for Disease Control in the Los Angeles County Department of Health, and that person had found a fifth such case. Together, the 5 cases were submitted to the Centers for Disease Control. Now, what you had were entirely old diseases. There was nothing new. Immune deficiencies have been seen before. Pneumocystis has been seen before. Kaposi sarcoma has been seen before. Not typically in this age group in men 25 to 50 years old in the United States, but still, it's been seen before and it has even been seen in those risk groups, just not commonly. You wouldn't typically expect 5. Remember, they had no connection to each other. But by the time they were reported as a group of 5, they were called a cluster, as if they had somehow maybe infected each other with some mysterious thing. You see, they had no connection to each other. Still, they were reported as a cluster. Remember I told you how clusters are used all too often by epidemiologists to say that a disease is infectious. And remember what I told you what clusters really mean, that a disease is not infectious. Well, in any case, these cases were reported to the Centers for Disease Control. The head of venereal diseases, head of infectious venereal diseases at the CDC, James Curran, got the report, wrote hot stuff across the top, rushed it into press with the MMWR of the Centers for Disease Control. This is a weekly newsletter. It goes out to the media. It's the basis of many news stories that you'll see on television or in the New York Times, which these reporters simply take whatever the government tells them without even asking whether this might be the right interpretation, might be the right conclusion. This directly plants stories in the news media all the time, and indeed it led to the beginning of what is now known as the AIDS epidemic. It was defined as an epidemic, defined as a cluster. Immediately, the Centers for Disease Control and shortly thereafter the virus hunters saw the opportunity in exploiting this and saying, here's a new disease that the entire public could catch, and you will all catch a deadly virus. Of course, they were already jumping several steps ahead of the game. How did they know it was a virus? Well, they didn't, but that was the story. So they put together a task force, and the task force focused its efforts because, you see, at this point, the very first scientists at the NIH to take a look at this cluster, or the first 50 cases that showed up. Once they started looking aggressively, they found more, and it turns out there had already been quite a number out there. But with increased surveillance, we now noticed them better. Some of the guys at the NIH began doing research and said, you know, maybe it's these poppers that these guys are using. Now, what are poppers? I mentioned those earlier. These are alkylated nitrites. They're amyl or butyl nitrites. They go under various street names, poppers, rush, death rush. They are liquids. They're discovered over 100 years ago. They can be used for certain kinds of heart patients for relief of angina under emergency conditions. But basically, what these things are, they're very highly reactive volatile compounds. In the way they react chemically, they are similar to carbon monoxide or cyanide in that, and they have not a fairly similar reactivity. If you inhale them, see the liquids evaporate and they're inhaled to the lungs and so forth, they will destroy everything. Hemoglobin, red blood cells, proteins, lipids, DNA, RNA, they mutate genes, they will cause cancer. They're related to compounds also definitely proved to cause cancer certainly in all kinds of laboratory animals. They're related to nitroxide compounds which cause pneumonia in rats in the laboratories. Very, very serious stuff. When I've told chemistry professors about the fact that homosexuals, fast lane male homosexuals in the fast lane lifestyle were using these drugs, I've had twice now the reaction from chemistry professors. Human beings are using that stuff? They couldn't believe it. It's extremely toxic. and you could easily, you know, die with that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's used very widely and has since been proven to destroy the T cells in mice, in laboratory mice, and deplete their immune systems in a way that's not unlike what can't handle it, too much abuse, too many of these chemicals, and finally the immune system gives out, and the T cells disappear, and the mice lose their immune system. That's been proven. Nevertheless, so these NIH scientists were looking at that and saying, you know, these poppers are an obvious candidate for what's going on. All of the first 50 AIDS cases, all of them admitted using poppers. Long-term, heavy amounts, 7 to 10 years on average, large doses, as many as 40 or 50 hits per night. Tremendous stuff. And you're talking about vast quantities of chemicals you're pouring in the body, and you're doing it several nights a week, 52 weeks a year, for 7 to 10 years. You do a lot of damage in that time if you survive and don't overdose. Now, the Centers for Disease Control recognized right away that they wanted this to be blamed on a virus. Their task force had as its goal to make it look like a new infectious disease rather than just a general problem of lack of health caused by certain drugs. So they went around and they could see it was in homosexuals. It was only showing up, I mean, there's these number of these odd diseases, not so odd diseases, but comparatively, showing up in these male homosexuals ages 25 to 50. So the CDC knew that they had to make it look like it's spreading out of its primary risk group. So they looked up heroin addicts in San Francisco and in New York, Central Park, dying of their heroin addiction, wasting away as heroin addicts always have done, and opium addicts, losing their immune systems. It's now been shown that heroin addicts will lose their immune systems progressively. If they get off the heroin, the immune systems can at least stabilize and sometimes begin to recover. It's the heroin, clearly, the opiates. And in any case, they found some of these who had tuberculosis or who had various forms of pneumonia, and they were called AIDS cases. So now you see this new disease, which had not yet been called AIDS, it had a different name at the time, was now spreading from the homosexuals to the heroin addicts. And then the next trick was to make it look like it was going through the blood supply. The CDC's task force combed the hospitals all around the country looking for hemophiliacs or blood transfusion recipients who had medical complications. And indeed, they often do. Just 25 years ago, the median life expectancy of a hemophiliac, a person who bleeds easily if cut, whose blood can't clot properly, the average life expectancy, or the median life expectancy, was about 11 years. That is to say, half of hemophiliacs were dead by age 11, very often of complications and pneumonias and other things associated with the blood disorder. That has gone up since HIV appeared on the scene, and now the median life expectancy is some 25 years, or almost 30. It's more than doubled since HIV. So, of course, one of the scientists involved, my co-author, Dr. Duesberg, jokes that HIV actually prolongs the life of hemophiliacs, HIV being the alleged AIDS virus. In any case, the hemophiliacs and blood transfusion recipients, I should mention that blood transfusions are given to people who are very, very sick. This should never be forgotten. We don't just give it to you on a basis like a federally subsidized lunch in the schools, or at least we shouldn't be. If you're getting a blood transfusion, you're in serious, serious bad shape already. As an average, nationwide, 50% of people who receive blood transfusions die within the first year, very often from pneumonias and immune deficiency complications. That's without HIV. Turns out now with studies it's the same with HIV as without, so that there's no difference at all. You simply have a high risk of these kinds of diseases when you have these kinds of disorders. Well, the CDC searched the hospitals and finally found a hemophiliac patient in Colorado who was dying of internal bleeding, of hemophilia, but he also happened to have a pneumonia, which they called pneumocystis. It's not clear if it was or not, but they called it that. Thereby, he became the first patient to receive AIDS through the blood supply, as if there was something in the blood rather than just his condition itself causing his sickness. So now, AIDS, you see, had spread through the blood supply. There was one more little piece that was thrown in for good measure. At least one member of the task force was sent down to Miami, Florida, and to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, to interview Haitians who were suffering from malnutrition and, like so many people from the third world, suffering tuberculosis, and even advanced tuberculosis. Thus, tuberculosis was now added to the growing AIDS definition, and at this point now Haitians were reclassified in large numbers as being AIDS patients. So now AIDS had spread to the Haitians. Later the story was changed so that AIDS had spread originally from the Haitians to us. So the story keeps changing, but the bottom line is it was made to look as if it had spread. With that kind of firepower behind it and with strings being pulled from behind the scenes, the virus hunters finally caught on and realized there was a new disease that they could re-justify their viruses with. At that point, and the public was now convinced by 1983 that this was a new disease caused by a virus, not just a syndrome of different people suffering different things. And so the virus hunters jumped in, blamed 4 viruses in a row as the cause of AIDS. HIV, the current accepted cause of AIDS, was not the first. The very first was none other than was something called cytomegalovirus, which is a herpes class virus, which causes cytomegalovirus disease. And it's been known to do that for a number of years. But cytomegalovirus was found in about 80% of these AIDS patients. It's found in about 70% of the population. So, but still, the main problem was that the cytomegalovirus or herpes virus researchers didn't have enough political clout or money within the biomedical research establishment in order to have their virus named as the cause of AIDS. The other herpes virologists got in on the act. These were the Epstein-Barr virologists, whose labs are devoted to the study of Epstein-Barr virus as a cause of Burkitt's lymphoma. But now, after 30 years, people have gotten a little bored of Burkitt's lymphoma, and furthermore, there are even a little bit some questions as to whether the virus might cause Burkitt's lymphoma. I talked about that a little earlier. So now the Epstein-Barr virologist nominated our virus is the cause of AIDS, please. Still didn't have enough clout. Some of Gallo's friends jumped to the rescue with HTLV1. Remember the virus I said that supposedly caused adult T-cell leukemia on this one Japanese island, but in fact there's no evidence, and for which Dr. Gallo had calculated a whopping 55-year latent period between infection and leukemia. So in other words, the virus was allegedly getting into the T-cells of your blood supply and making the T-cells grow into a cancer. Well, now these same guys offered HTLV1 as the cause of AIDS, meaning that the same virus goes into the T-cells and kills off the T-cells. Believe it or not, it took these guys several months before some wiseacre finally realized that they're saying that the same virus that gets in the T-cells and makes them grow too well is killing off and making the T-cells disappear. Someone realized that was a contradiction, and at that point, HTLV1 was dropped. Finally, it was concluded they had to actually have a new virus, and so Dr. Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute in Paris finally went into the lymph nodes of a gay man who did not have AIDS and isolated from the lymph nodes a new retrovirus related, sort of generally in the same category as HTLV1, but it was a new one. You can isolate all the time. New viruses are being isolated constantly. They don't cause anything, but they're being isolated. This virus later came to be known as the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. It became blamed as the cause of AIDS at a press conference that I alluded to earlier. April 23rd, 1984, Dr. Robert Gallo, who had received a sample of this virus from Dr. Montagnier in Paris for comparison with his own isolate that he never produced, shortly thereafter, Dr. Gallo had now co-discovered the virus, and his virus was absolutely identical to the French virus. So once again, Dr. Gallo is full of coincidences and tremendous discoveries. He held a press conference with Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler. At this press conference, it was officially announced that it's now the view of the United States government that this virus, later to be known as HIV, is the cause of AIDS. It's the 4th virus. There were no scientific papers, no scientific symposia. This was a press conference to the New York Times and the television networks, Time magazine. This was not a scientific forum. Scientists didn't even know this was coming, and when it was announced, they were boggled. They said, well, what's the basis for this? Scientists had no way to evaluate whether this was true or not. Was this virus, in fact, the cause of AIDS? But it was established, and from that day forward, the federal funding on AIDS was devoted exclusively to HIV research. From that day forward, if you are a scientist and you need a grant to survive to keep your lab open, you want to do AIDS research, you better not do it on anything but HIV because you won't get a grant otherwise. So right away, all the scientists went back to their offices and wrote up grant proposals to study HIV, each one figuring, well, I may not be able to do anything about it, but at least I can keep my lab going and maybe contribute a little research on this virus, whatever it is. So, of course, the whole scientific community, bought by the money, the herd mentality, simply bought into the virus as soon as they knew that's where the money was coming. And that's generally how decisions are made within science today. Someone decides what causes something, then the money flows there, and then the scientists agree and back that up. So, of course, from that day forward, HIV has been locked in as the official cause of AIDS. The question is, does it really cause AIDS? There are now nearly 100,000 scientific papers produced on HIV, more than for any virus in the history of the world. We know this thing backward and forward, inside out, its biochemical structure, its properties. We've infected in every conceivable animal. We've sequenced it genetically, forward, backward, upside down. We know everything about this virus. And the biggest thing that keeps becoming more and more mysterious is how could such a simple, ordinary, harmless, typical, standard, conventional virus possibly cause a disease or a syndrome like AIDS? The fact is, as I'm going to show you, it doesn't. Robert Koch, in discovering that, or proving that a bacterium caused tuberculosis, came up with a series of 4 postulates or tests that had to be met to prove that a particular germ causes a particular disease. So you didn't just isolate some random germ and say that's the cause. Number 1 is every case of the disease has to be infected with the virus. And not just infected meaning in the past where you have antibodies, but infected actively. You've got to be oozing virus. It's got to be pouring out of you. There's got to be a tremendous amount while you have the symptoms, while you're sick. Number 2, you have to be able to isolate the virus, show that it really is a virus. Number 3 is you have to be able to take that virus, put it in an animal, and see whether the animal will develop the same disease. If you can't find any animal to develop it, but you still are convinced that the virus causes the disease, you could test it through a reverse method in humans. That is, you don't infect prisoners or anything with the virus, although some countries at some times, I suppose, have done that. You're not supposed to do that. The way you do that is you get someone who has an infection already of the virus for whatever reason and find a way to help him get immunized against it, to get rid of the virus and make antibodies. The virus goes away. If by neutralizing the virus you now cause him to recover, so he gets over his symptoms and recovers from the disease, then you can say it caused the disease. Whereas if you neutralize the virus, but he's still sick, well then it wasn't the cause of the disease. You got rid of the wrong factor. And then the 4th one is you have to repeat those steps one more time, just to make sure, take the virus back out of the new patient, run it through one more cycle. Does HIV fulfill these postulates? I should point out, first of all, that all classic infectious diseases do meet these postulates. Polio, measles, flu, cold, herpes, you name it, tuberculosis, yellow fever, cholera, they all meet these, the classic infectious diseases all meet these postulates easily. What about HIV? Well, first thing you have to understand is that AIDS is not a single disease, as we mentioned before. It's a list of diseases. On January 1st, 1993, it was once again expanded now to a list of some 30 different conditions, totally unrelated. About 2/3 of them are the result of immune deficiencies, tuberculosis, pneumonias, various things that if you have a low immune system, the germs take over. 1/3 of them have nothing to do with immune deficiency. These are the cancers, Kaposi sarcoma, various lymphomas. Also dementia, the malfunctioning of the mind. Also wasting syndrome, where they waste away, diarrhea and losing weight. None of these are related to immune deficiencies. All of these have been grouped together under one umbrella and called AIDS. If you have one of those diseases and you are positive for antibodies against HIV, that disease is now renamed AIDS. So you walk into the doctor with a tuberculosis, now at any stage. It used to be disseminated, now it's any stage. Walk in with a tuberculosis. He'll test your blood. If you're HIV positive, sorry, buddy, you're doomed. You're going to die. We'll give you some toxic drugs. Maybe we can keep you alive for a few months. You're finished. That's AIDS. And it's called AIDS and is reported to the Centers for Disease Control. You walk in with the same tuberculosis, same person. Your blood tests negative for antibodies against HIV. Oh, you have tuberculosis. We'll give you some Bactrim or Septra, and you'll be fine within a couple of weeks. That's the difference in treatment. Same condition, identical. You can't tell the difference, but this is how it's going on. And so the first question is, do all AIDS cases have HIV? Koch's first postulate. And the answer, number 1, is no. We now know from some 75 to 80 studies minimum, if not more, documented over 5,000 cases of people who have AIDS diseases and serious immune deficiencies in the risk groups, never seen HIV in their lives. They're HIV negative. So their diseases are not called AIDS, but they're identical in every way, shape, and form. It's just by circular reasoning, by definition, they're not called AIDS, and that's all. Same homosexuals with Kaposi sarcoma, drug addicts with tuberculosis, Haitians, Africans with slim disease, hemophiliacs, blood transfusion recipients with various pneumonias. Same exact things. T-cell deficiencies, the works. They look like AIDS patients, they act like AIDS patients, they die like AIDS patients, but no. Furthermore, those who are HIV positive are only antibody positive. That is, the virus was gotten rid of years earlier. All that's left are antibodies, among antibodies against many other old viruses your body has seen. When they're dying of AIDS, the HIV virus is long gone, so it's not active in the body at all. It's just antibodies left. So in no way, shape, or form do AIDS patients meet Koch's first postulate. Second postulate, can we isolate the virus? Yes, with great difficulty, because by the time we're looking for it, it's long gone, so you're lucky if you find a piece of it somewhere. Third, can you cause AIDS in animals? The answer simply is no. Chimpanzees and baboons can be infected with HIV. However, to this day, not a one of them has ever developed AIDS. That's 12 years later. We have 150 chimpanzees at primate research centers in this country, and they've been injected, and they're all happily jumping around making fun of the scientists who keep waiting for them to get sick. Also, HIV, when grown in T cells in the laboratory, does not kill the T cells. In humans, 95% of the world's 14 million HIV positives who have had HIV antibodies since at least 1985, for at least 10 years, since the test was first available, 95% of them are like Magic Johnson, HIV positive, healthy, and living normal lives. They don't seem to be developing AIDS. It's 10 years later. And in fact, just to point out that HIV itself was, or the AIDS was originally thought to have a latent period from the time of virus infection, and 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, now pushing all the way up to 15 years potentially. It's still considered 10 to 12 officially, because simply most HIV positives are not getting sick, and it's a problem. They're waiting and waiting and waiting for these people to die of AIDS, and nothing's happening. So we don't know what's going on there. The fourth postulate is irrelevant. Why repeat postulates that have already failed? The entire medical literature is clear. HIV doesn't cause AIDS. What does? Well, we talked about the drugs earlier. We believe 94% of AIDS cases in the United States and about 99% in Europe are explained entirely by heroin addiction or the drug abuse of the fast lane male homosexual lifestyle. Male homosexuals who are not in the fast lane lifestyle and do not do drugs do not get AIDS. Don't be fooled if you think that you may have heard of such cases before. Studies have been done, the surveys have been done, they all admit to it. There are no tests, no examples that can be found anywhere in the medical literature of any single exception to that rule. We don't know of it, our opponents in this AIDS debate don't know about it. We simply have no example. So it's purely with the drugs. The 80% or more pediatric AIDS are born to mothers who use heroin or cocaine during pregnancy. These are crack babies. The remainder are babies with hemophilia or who need blood transfusions. These are not ordinary babies who just get HIV. Babies with just HIV don't get sick. In Africa, it turns out that a portion of the U.S. Budget for foreign aid is given to Central African AIDS belt countries in proportion to the number of AIDS cases they report. So you can imagine what that does to AIDS statistics out of Africa. Naturally, now they're redefining starvation-associated diseases like tuberculosis and wasting disease that have been around for as long as we can document in Africa, and even diabetes, malaria, even automobile accidents are being registered as AIDS deaths in Africa to justify more money. You have whole AIDS industries there, guys driving around Mercedes-Benzes, nice Italian suits. They go to meetings of the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, in order to participate in functions, and all of this financed by this tremendous AIDS budget. The African countries want those statistics up. They want to blame everything on AIDS. It turns out that when you simply feed African AIDS patients, they generally recover. It appears to be mostly starvation-induced. There are a few cases in the cities that may be prostitutes using drugs. Same in Thailand. It's just a handful of people there, very little AIDS there. The handful of people are all prostitutes smoking cocaine or heroin or opium. So we believe it's the. Now I should mention at this point that since 1987 there has been one additional cause of AIDS that's added to this list, unfortunately, and it's again a consequence of the way that the fact that we're blaming AIDS on a virus that apparently has nothing to do with the disease at all, and that is the treatment. The primary treatment is AZT or azidothymidine. It's an old revived cancer chemotherapy developed originally in the 1960s. It's a particularly effective one, more so than others, and was so toxic that was not approved even for leukemia treatment at that time. Fairly stiff drugs, but AZT was not approved. It was pulled off the shelf in 1986 for reapproval for treatment of AIDS to attack, the idea was it would attack the AIDS virus or HIV, which of course is gone in people who are HIV positive. They only have antibodies left, and then we have other people who've never even been infected. So what virus are you attacking? There's no virus to attack. But anyway, it was revived as an antiviral. And as I mentioned to you, cancer chemotherapies, which kill dividing cells, and in cancer patients will destroy the immune systems. Many of these patients develop pneumocystis carinii, pneumonia, and other AIDS-like diseases. And here we are reviving a cancer chemotherapy, and a particularly toxic one, for use in AIDS. So how did this happen? Well, it didn't meet the normal FDA testing requirements. The answer was that the pharmaceutical companies and the federal government were paying the various AIDS activist organizations to go out and protest for quick release of AZT. Thus, the FDA now had an excuse to bypass the normal testing requirements. Were not done. The human studies were cut short and inadequate. The cell culture studies were flubbed and not really carefully followed through on. And so, in fact, everything was bypassed. The drug was rushed to approval on an emergency basis and made available. Since that time, the three other major AIDS drugs, DDI, DDC, D4T, all of them exactly the same category of failed cancer chemotherapies as AZT. These drugs now are all approved for AIDS treatment. Primarily, it's still AZT. In the meantime, the long-term, hardcore, large-scale studies, the 3-year studies involving hundreds and thousands of people, are now showing that those people who take AZT are not only not any better off, but in general, it's pretty clear, even with obscuring the data in these papers, it's pretty clear those taking AZT are getting sick sooner and worse and dying of AIDS sooner than people who don't take AZT. Since 1987, it has been approved for treatment of AIDS, meaning it's accelerating the AIDS deaths of people, and since 1990 for the prevention of AIDS in otherwise healthy people. We believe this was the clear reason for the death of Arthur Ashe, the former tennis player who was HIV positive for a number of years and had no significant problems other than his pre-existing heart condition. But 4 years of AZT in the last 10 months, combination AZT-DDI, his immune system wasted and pneumonia, and he died. Same with the girl in Florida who supposedly got AIDS from her dentist, Kimberly Brigalis, who apparently the virus didn't even come from the dentist, but for that matter, we don't know if she might have had the virus pretty much all her life, maybe from birth. No one has investigated. Centers for Disease Control wanted people to believe that it was a dentist-to-patient transmission to help get some legislation passed through Congress at the time. The publicity generated public fear and did get the legislation passed. And so everyone today believes that a dentist gave AIDS to a patient. But the dentist was a fast-lane male homosexual, apparently using all the drugs, dying with Kaposi sarcoma. Kimberly Brigalis had no problems until she began taking AZT. At that point, she developed a serious yeast infection, oral candidiasis. Then skin infections, she began getting pneumonias recurring, she began wasting away, and within somewhere between 1 and 2 years, she was in a wheelchair and then dead. Classic cancer chemotherapy patient, classic AIDS patient, call it what you will. We think she died of the treatment AZT. Currently, nearly 200,000 people worldwide are using AZT or these other drugs on prescribed by doctors every day. And we believe this is causing and certainly preventing the curing of many AIDS cases. The last thing I'll simply say about this is that the only long-term AIDS survivors we have ever known, we have ever seen documented anywhere, every one of them avoids these treatments, AZT, the other 3 drugs. Also, I would avoid Epivir, the new drug that has come out. It's a protease inhibitor. It's a different category of drug, but believe you me, it'll hurt your pancreas, it may hurt your liver, it's going to be bad for you in any case, and it won't help, but it's supposed to attack a virus that isn't even there anymore. So how can it possibly help? And very expensive, and made by the same company that brought you AZT. Burroughs welcome. Now, and it was also rushed through on fast-track proper testing. But the long-term survivors are people who don't take AZT and don't take these drugs. They get off the drugs, all the other drugs, the poppers, the cocaine, Quaaludes, heroin, whatever, and they start eating normal meals. And then they'll credit some of their recovery to various diets and herbs and vitamins and so forth. I don't know about that sort of thing, but I will say that by straightening up their act, that many of them are long-term survivors alive even today, 10 years or more after an initial diagnosis of full-blown AIDS. So this is how you survive. The problem is the politics here. The federal government has spent, as I say, about $40 billion in the war on AIDS, almost all of it on HIV, certainly everything since 1984 on HIV. And this amounts to about $7.5 billion per year. This means that there are thousands of scientists who are the AIDS researchers are absolutely committed to the virus. Their whole careers are built on it. It means that we've got the AIDS activist movement completely paid off with this money, the American Red Cross, hemophiliac organizations, government institutions, Elizabeth Taylor's foundation that works with her. All of these people are getting money off the AIDS gravy train, so don't expect them to have any interest in this. Moreover, they don't want the gravy train to stop. They know that it exists only because you, the public, are scared to death of the deadly virus. You think that you can get infected, and we've got to finance this war against the deadly virus to help stave it off. As a result, the scientists, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, the very prestigious heavyweight scientists who are talking about this have encountered some amazing roadblocks they haven't finished for holding these views, and this is why you're not hearing about these views publicly. My co-author, Dr. Duesberg, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and prestigious virologist, one of the leading virologists of our day, if not the leading one, as some people have been inclined to call him, he lost his grant, his research grant. He's losing his lab. He's lost his graduate students. I was thrown out of graduate school right before I could file a thesis for my PhD in molecular biology, again because it was discovered. Other scientists, Dr. Joseph Sonnabend was the very first scientist back in 1983 and 84 to challenge this virus view. He lost his grant. He lost his journal, which he founded on AIDS research. He was a very prestigious, very respected medical researcher, very important connections. He was severely punished, so much so that by the late 1980s he began going back to the other side, not for reasons of evidence, but because he wanted his money back. And he's finally gotten his grant back, and he has some position back because he has because he's defected back from our side. Dr. Duesberg appears to be in a similar process right now, and I've not really spoken with him in quite a while, but he's now dissociating himself from some of the books that he's co-authored, including mine and including another one out of Ohio, on this subject. He does not yet recant his views, but it's possible that this could happen. He has been made offers, as it turns out, from the federal government. He would get his grants back and he would get prizes, whatever else he wants, if he would recant his views on HIV not causing AIDS. And there's tremendous pressure brought to bear on these other scientists. Only those who are retired and don't function off of grants have been pressure consistently. We have 3 Nobel laureates, and again, they have encountered some pressure as well. So there's tremendous censorship brought to bear, tremendous pressure on the media not to cover the story. Journalists who cover it find themselves cut off from sources of information for news stories from the federal government. And this is not something I've invented. The fact is that the director, the de facto director by the federal government, or of the federal government's war on AIDS, Anthony Fauci, in the late 1980s wrote an open editorial published in the AAAS newsletter, American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, in which he warned journalists, anyone who covers this AIDS debate and the scientists who question whether the AIDS is caused by this virus, any reporter who covers that will be isolated and frozen out of the loop. We won't give them any news, and you won't be able to hold a job with your newspaper. He said that openly, but he knows that the average American person doesn't read that. I document that again in my book, and along with a whole campaign of censorship, how every time to be interviewed on Good Morning America, Larry King Live, Newsweek, magazine, CNN, magazines, newspapers, television, very often, most of the time, it has been censored, sometimes hours before broadcast. And with nobody left to substitute, they would bring in Anthony Fauci from the federal government to talk about AIDS and nothing else. So the debate is being kept quiet. We are making this video program tonight to help bring the word to you, the average American citizen, the person who's paying for all of this with your taxes and whose vote has been allowing these people to get away with this. We're trying to let you realize the scam that has been carried out. However, we also wrote, or I wrote this book, Why We Will Never Win the War on AIDS, precisely to document all of this. And we took that to one publisher after another. Most New York publishers were excited by the manuscript but found it to be so controversial they were scared of it, wouldn't make an offer. We had 2 publishers in a row who finally, first one, then the other later, signed contracts to publish, backed out at the last minute months later. Each one in turn. They took it to the second one, backed out. None of the others would take the book. Finally, in frustration, we published the book ourselves, and then wouldn't you know it, some strange publisher out of Washington, D.C., called Regnery Publishing, managed by a person who is a former top official of the U.S. Justice Department, as is his lawyer, as was the judge in the court to which they took the lawsuit, bought up one of the contracts, one of the dead contracts from one of the publishers who had refused to publish the book, and managed with the judge's cooperation to win the lawsuit against us. Just a few weeks ago, on November 30th, Judge John E. Sprizzo of the Southern District of New York Federal Court issued a temporary restraining order, which is now being turned into a permanent injunction banning this book forever. This publisher is not printing the book. He's not making any preparations to print the book. He's already rewritten it so grotesquely that if he ever does release it, it's lost most of its key information. has been heavily censored. As a result, as it stands right now, I can't sell it to you, I can't distribute it to you, I can't give it to you for free in any form, electronic or otherwise. That's the ban. We're also going to be ordered, apparently, to destroy, burn, I guess, those books that we currently have. If you think this is unreal, believe me, the lawyers who worked on this case and other lawyers who've talked about it cannot believe what happened. Basically, the judge very clearly was very hostile to us during the entire proceeding and broke the law repeatedly, has completely redefined contract law, redefined copyright law, a contract that had no force or power so as to censor this book. So it's a very, very crazy situation. But we have, possibly for the first time in United States history, a serious documentary book has been banned by the federal government. This could be indefinite. We are now currently fighting an appeal on this. We hope that the kind of influence that was pulled with this federal judge will not be pulled with the appellate court in the Second Circuit in New York, but we don't know, and we're not counting on anything at this point. So what we would ask you to do at this point, we will be trying to come out with information, try to give you some of the information that was in the book periodically, let you know some of what was in there. I've tried to give some of it to you in the speech tonight. We're working very hard to try to get the information out and defend the book and perhaps get it unbanned sometime in the next year. It could take a very, very long time. It might never happen. So we have set up, in the meantime, to help defend this case, we set up a legal defense fund called the Save the AIDS Book, S-T-A-B, STAB, Save the AIDS Book Legal Defense Fund. And if you will make a $20 donation to the defense fund, then we will sign you up for a newsletter that will keep you up to date, not only on the progress of the lawsuit against the book, but also some information on this topic. It will be coming out every month, and we'll try to get this to you. It'll be a free newsletter for the donation, plus we will keep you informed of other opportunities for other presentations and information. We'll have future videotapes and other presentations. What is most important now is